Imagine driving alone on a desolate road, only to find yourself caught in a deadly encounter that feels like it's ripped straight out of a nightmare. This is the true story of a trucker who picked up a stranger, only to uncover a chilling secret that nearly cost him his life. My name is Jebada Jeb Conway, and this happened to me on August 14th, 1987. I was hauling a load of lumber from a mill in Oregon down to a construction site in Nevada. I've been a trucker for almost 20 years now, and I've seen a lot of weird stuff on the road, but nothing like this. Buckle up, because this is going to be a wild ride. The route I was taking was a lesser-known highway, the kind of road only truckers and locals knew about. It cut through miles of dense forest, winding and narrow, but it shaved a good 2 hours off my trip. I was making good time and decided to pull over at a small truck stop near the Nevada border. It was one of those places you'd miss if you blinked: just a diner, a gas pump, and a few parking spaces. Inside the diner, the waitress, a middle-aged woman with frizzy hair named Linda, poured me a coffee. There were a couple of other truckers in there, but the place was pretty dead. "You're new here?" she asked, her voice raspy from too many cigarettes. "Just passing through," I replied, taking a sip of the surprisingly good coffee. Linda leaned in a little, her eyes narrowing. "You be careful on that road, honey. Not everyone makes it through there." I chuckled. "What, you got bears or something?" She didn't laugh. She said, "Just be careful." I finished my meal and paid the bill, leaving a decent tip for Linda. Back in my truck, I felt a little uneasy, but I chalked it up to Linda's weird warning. I started the engine and got back on the road. It was getting dark, and the forest seemed to close in around me as I drove deeper into the middle of nowhere. The only sound was the hum of my tires on the pavement and the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. About an hour into the drive, I saw something up ahead, a car with its hazard lights on, pulled over to the side. I slowed down and rolled down my window. "You need help?" I called out. A man emerged from the shadows. He looked to be in his 30s, dressed in a plaid shirt and jeans, his face shadowed by a baseball cap. "Yeah, my car broke down. Can you give me a lift to the next town?" I hesitated for a moment. Something about the guy seemed off, but it was late, and he looked desperate. "All right, hop in," I said. He climbed into the passenger seat, and we got back on the road. "Name's Rick," he said, extending a hand. "Jeb," I replied, shaking his hand. It was clammy and cold. We drove in silence for a while. Rick kept fidgeting, glancing around nervously. I tried to make small talk, but he just gave one-word answers. After a few miles, I noticed he was staring at the glove compartment. "You got a gun in there?" he asked suddenly. I shook my head. "Nope. Don't believe in carrying one?" Rick nodded, but I could see the gears turning in his head. I decided to keep an eye on him. Something wasn't right. As we rounded a bend, the road ahead was blocked by a fallen tree. I cursed under my breath and stopped the truck. "Looks like we're walking," I said, reaching for the flashlight I kept under the seat. Rick didn't move. "You go ahead. I'll wait here." I narrowed my eyes at him in the dark. "What are you afraid of?" He didn't answer, just stared straight ahead. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped out of the truck, leaving the door open. As I walked towards the fallen tree, I heard Rick's door open and close. I turned around, the flashlight beam catching him as he sprinted into the woods. What the hell? I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. I had half a mind to leave him there, but something told me to follow. I walked into the woods, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The trees were dense, their branches creating eerie shapes in the dim light. I could hear Rick crashing through the underbrush ahead of me. "Rick," I called out. "Where the hell are you going?" No answer. I kept walking, my senses on high alert. After a few minutes, I found a clearing with an old, dilapidated cabin in the center. The door was ajar, and I could see a faint light flickering inside. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin was small, just one room with a table, a couple of chairs, and a bed in the corner. A single lantern cast a dim light, casting long shadows on the walls. And there, sitting at the table, was Rick. But he wasn't alone. Across from him was another man, older, with a grizzled beard and a cold, dead look in his eyes. Well, the older man said, his voice dripping with menace. "Look what we have here." I backed towards the door, but the older man stood up, blocking my escape. "You're not going anywhere, friend," he said. I glanced at Rick, who looked like he was about to bolt again. "What's going on here?" I demanded. The older man chuckled. "Just a little business transaction. Rick here owes me, and you're going to help him pay up." Before I could react, the older man lunged at me, a knife flashing in his hand. I managed to dodge the blade, but it grazed my arm. I grabbed a chair and swung it at him, connecting with a satisfying thud. He staggered back but didn't go down. Rick took that moment to make a run for it, darting out the door. I didn't have time to chase him. The older man recovered quickly, slashing at me again. I kicked the table towards him, buying myself a few precious seconds. My eyes darted around the room, landing on an old hunting rifle mounted on the wall. I made a break for it, ripping it off the wall, just as the older man charged at me. I swung the rifle like a club, catching him in the side. He went down, but I knew he wouldn't stay down for long. I checked the rifle. It was loaded. I aimed it at the older man, my hands shaking. "Stay down," I warned. He laughed, a harsh, guttural sound. "You don't have the guts." I pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening in the small cabin. The older man collapsed, blood pooling around him. I stood there, breathing hard, the rifle still aimed at his lifeless body. Rick was gone, but I didn't care. I needed to get out of there. I left the cabin, making my way back to the truck. The fallen tree was still there, but I didn't care. I climbed back into the cab and locked the doors, my hands still shaking. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. Eventually, I called the police, telling them about the cabin and the man I had shot. They arrived a couple of hours later, and I led them back to the cabin. They found the body just as I had described, but there was no sign of Rick. They searched the woods, but he was long gone. The police took my statement and let me go. They ruled it self-defense, but that didn't make me feel any better. I got back in my truck and drove away, leaving the nightmare behind. I finished my delivery in Nevada and headed back home. I couldn't shake the feeling that Rick was still out there somewhere. Every time I passed a broken down car or saw someone hitchhiking, I thought of him. It's been years since that night, but it still haunts me. I've seen a lot of things on the road, but nothing like that. And I hope I never do again. So, if you ever find yourself driving down a lonely highway and see a stranded driver, think twice before you stop. You never know what kind of trouble you might be inviting into your life. What would you do if your engine failed in the middle of nowhere and the only help came from a stranger with a terrifying secret? This trucker lived through a nightmare you'll never forget. My name is Quentin Boyd, and this happened to me on September 17th, 2004. I was driving my rig through a part of Oregon that you probably haven't heard of, a town called Burns. It's the kind of place where people keep to themselves, and you might not see a soul for miles. I was hauling a load of lumber to Boise, taking a route that wasn't my usual. A storm had closed the main highway, and dispatch had sent me on this detour. I've been trucking for nearly 20 years, and I'm used to the long, lonely stretches of road. The cab of my truck is like a second home, complete with a small fridge, a bunk, and a collection of old cassettes. I was listening to a Johnny Cash tape, trying to stay awake and alert. The rain was coming down hard, and the wipers were working overtime. The headlights cut through the darkness, but visibility was still lousy. About an hour out of Burns, the engine started to sputter. At first, I thought it was just the rough road, but then it cut out completely. I coasted to the side of the road, cursing under my breath. This wasn't the first time my rig had given me trouble, but it was the worst possible timing. I grabbed my flashlight and popped the hood, hoping it was something simple I could fix. I'm no mechanic, but I know my way around an engine well enough to keep it running. This time, though, I couldn't figure out what was wrong. Everything looked fine, but it just wouldn't start. I tried the radio to call for help, but there was nothing but static. I was about to get back in the cab and wait for a passing car when I saw a light in the distance. It was a small house set back from the road, with no driveway or path leading to it, just an overgrown field. I decided to hike over and see if I could use their phone. I grabbed my jacket and started walking, the rain soaking me to the bone. The light in the house was faint but steady, a small beacon in the middle of nowhere. As I got closer, I noticed how run down the place looked. The paint was peeling, and the windows were dirty and cracked. Still, I was desperate. I knocked on the door and waited. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Finally, I heard footsteps, and the door creaked open a few inches. An old man peered out at me, his face mostly hidden in the shadows. He had wild gray hair and a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in years. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice gruff. "My truck broke down," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to use a phone." The old man stared at me for a long moment before he nodded and opened the door wider. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. I hesitated for a second, then walked in. The inside of the house was even more run down than the outside. The air was musty, and the only light came from a few dim lamps. The furniture was old and mismatched, and there were stacks of newspapers and magazines everywhere. "Phone's in the kitchen," the old man said, pointing to a doorway. I thanked him and headed that way, but something about the place was giving me the creeps. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just tired and wet. The kitchen was cluttered and dirty, but I found the phone on the wall. I picked it up and listened for a dial tone. Nothing. I jiggled the cradle and tried again. Still nothing. "It's dead," the old man said from the doorway. "Hasn't worked in years." I turned to him, feeling a knot of frustration in my chest. "Do you have a cell phone?" He shook his head. "No signal out here." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "Is there anyone else around?" A neighbor with a working phone. The old man shook his head again. "Closest neighbor is 5 miles down the road. You're welcome to stay here until morning. Then you can walk it." I didn't like the idea of staying in that house, but I didn't have much choice. I nodded and thanked him. He showed me to a small room with a cot and a single, dusty window. "You can sleep here," he said. "I'll bring you some blankets." "Thanks," I said, forcing a smile. The old man left and I sat down on the cot. The room was cold and damp, and I could hear the rain beating against the window. I took off my wet jacket and boots, then lay down, hoping to get some rest. I must have drifted off because I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. I sat up, straining to listen. It was faint, but it sounded like footsteps crunching on gravel. I got up and went to the window, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. My gut told me something was wrong. I decided to grab my flashlight and check it out. I crept down the hall, trying to be as quiet as possible. The house was silent, except for the rain. When I reached the front door, I paused and listened again. The footsteps had stopped. I opened the door and stepped outside, the cold air hitting me like a slap. I shined my flashlight around, but there was no one there, just the empty road and the rain. I was about to go back inside when I heard it again. The footsteps, this time coming from the side of the house. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. When I rounded the corner, I saw a figure standing by the edge of the field. It was the old man, and he was dragging something heavy through the mud. "What are you doing?" I called out, my voice shaky. The old man stopped and turned to me, his eyes wide. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he dropped whatever he was holding and ran towards me. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my hand. Before I could react, he tackled me to the ground. We struggled in the mud, his hands around my throat. I fought back, kicking and punching, but he was surprisingly strong. Somehow I managed to break free and scramble to my feet. I grabbed the flashlight and swung it at him, hitting him in the head. He fell back, clutching his skull. I didn't wait to see if he was okay. I ran back to the house and slammed the door behind me, locking it. My mind was racing. What the hell was that old man doing out there? And what was he dragging? I remembered the thing he dropped and decided I had to see what it was. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and went back outside, keeping my eyes peeled for any sign of the old man. When I reached the spot where he'd been, I shined the flashlight on the ground. My blood ran cold. It was a body, wrapped in a tarp. I could see a hand sticking out, pale and lifeless. I backed away, feeling sick. I had to get out of there, but my truck was dead, and there was no one around for miles. I heard a noise behind me and turned to see the old man, blood running down his face. He had a gun pointed at me. "Shouldn't have come out here," he said, his voice calm. "Should have stayed in your truck." I raised my hands, trying to stay calm. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I just want to leave." "Leave?" He shook his head. "Can't let you do that." He pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, and I felt a searing pain in my side. I dropped to the ground, clutching the wound. The old man walked over and stood above me, the gun still aimed at my head. "Why are you doing this?" I gasped, struggling to breathe. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised the gun again. Just as he was about to fire, there was a shout from the road. A car had pulled up, and a man was getting out. The old man turned, distracted, and I took my chance. I grabbed the knife and lunged at him, stabbing him in the leg. He cried out and fell, dropping the gun. The man from the car ran over and grabbed the gun, pointing it at the old man. "Don't move," he shouted. I lay back, panting and bleeding. The man called for help on his cell phone, and within minutes, the police and an ambulance arrived. They took the old man away in handcuffs, and rushed me to the hospital. I found out later that the old man was a drifter living in that abandoned house for years. He had a history of violence and had been on the run for a long time. The body in the tarp was another trucker who had broken down on the same road a few days earlier. I was lucky to be alive. I still drive that route sometimes, but I never take the back roads anymore. And I always make sure my rig is in top shape before I hit the road. You never know what kind of trouble you might run into out there. My name is Neil Grayson, and this happened to me on August 15th, 1996. I've been driving trucks for over 20 years now, crisscrossing the country from coast to coast. That night I was headed to a small town in Missouri to drop off a load of auto parts. The route was familiar, but what happened that night was anything but. I had just refueled at a truck stop off I-44, grabbed a cup of coffee, and a greasy burger to keep me going until I hit my destination. I chatted briefly with a fellow driver, Rick, who was headed in the opposite direction. We swapped the usual banter about lousy food, the weather, and those ever-present dot checks. "Stay safe out there," Rick said, climbing back into his rig. I nodded, waved, and headed back to my own truck, a sturdy Kenworth I'd nicknamed Betsy. Little did I know, safe was the last thing I'd be that night. The first sign of trouble came about 50 miles out of the truck stop. I was driving through a remote stretch of highway when I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. Nothing unusual about that except they were getting closer fast. Before I knew it, the car was right on my bumper, flashing its high beams. I figured it was some hothead in a hurry, so I tapped my brakes lightly to signal him to back off. Instead, the car swerved to the side and accelerated, passing me on the left. As it did, I got a good look at the driver. He was a man with wild, dark eyes and a twisted grin. For a split second, he seemed to lock eyes with me before speeding ahead and disappearing into the night. Shaking off the encounter, I focused back on the road. Aggressive drivers weren't uncommon, especially on these lonely stretches. Still, there was something unsettling about the guy's look. I shrugged it off and turned up the radio, losing myself in some classic rock. About an hour later, I saw the same car again. This time it was pulled over on the side of the road with the hood up. The driver was nowhere in sight. I should have kept going, but something made me slow down. Maybe it was curiosity, or that nagging feeling that something was off. Either way, I decided to stop and check it out. I pulled Betsy over and grabbed my flashlight before stepping out into the humid night. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the distant hum of cicadas. As I approached the car, I called out, "Hey, you need some help?" No response. Cautiously, I walked around to the front of the car. The engine was still running, but there was no one in sight. I felt a prickling at the back of my neck. Turning back toward my truck, I nearly jumped out of my skin when I saw the driver standing there, right beside Betsy. He was tall, lanky, and now that I could see him up close, his eyes were even more unsettling. They had a wild, almost feral glint to them. "Everything all right, man?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't reply. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a knife. My heart skipped a beat. This was bad, real bad. "Whoa. Hey, no need for that," I said, backing away slowly. "I'm just trying to help." He started walking toward me, the knife glinting in the moonlight. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. Running wasn't an option. He'd catch me in seconds. I needed to get back to Betsy, where I had a tire iron under the seat. I turned and bolted for my truck, hearing his footsteps pounding behind me. I reached Betsy and yanked the door open, scrambling inside just as the knife slammed into the metal doorframe. I grabbed the tire iron and swung it around, catching him in the arm. He let out a grunt and stumbled back, clutching his arm. I didn't waste any time. I threw Betsy into gear and floored it, leaving the man and his broken-down car behind. My heart was pounding, adrenaline surging through my veins. I drove for what felt like hours, not daring to slow down or look back. Finally, I saw the lights of a small diner up ahead. I pulled into the parking lot, shaking and covered in sweat. Inside, the place was nearly empty, just a couple of truckers and the waitress behind the counter. I stumbled in, probably looking like I'd seen a ghost. The waitress, a kind-looking woman in her 40s, approached me. "You all right, On? You look like you've been through hell." I nodded, trying to catch my breath. I need to call the cops. There's a guy out there. He tried to kill me." She didn't ask any more questions, just handed me the phone. I called the local sheriff's office and told them everything. They said they'd send someone out to meet me at the diner. While I waited, I ordered a cup of coffee, my hand still trembling as I lifted it to my lips. The other truckers gave me curious glances but didn't say anything. Truck drivers see all kinds of things on the road, but what I just experienced was beyond the usual. It wasn't long before a couple of deputies showed up. I recounted the whole story to them, every detail I could remember about the man and his car. They took notes and promised to search the area. "You did the right thing," Neil, one of the deputies, said, clapping me on the shoulder. "We'll find this guy." I nodded, though I wasn't entirely convinced. That look in the man's eyes was something I'd never forget. It haunted me the whole rest of my trip and for weeks after. A few days later, I got a call from the sheriff's office. They'd found the car abandoned on a side road, but there was no sign of the driver. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. They asked me to come down to the station to look at some mugshots, but none of them matched the man I'd seen. Life went on as it does. I kept driving, though I was more cautious, always checking my mirrors and keeping my doors locked. The memory of that night stayed with me, a constant reminder of how quickly things can go wrong. A month later, I was back at that same truck stop on I-44. As I refueled, I saw Rick again. We exchanged nods and he walked over. "Heard you had some trouble a while back," he said, lighting a cigarette. "Word gets around." "Yeah," I said, trying to keep it light. "Some nut job with a knife. Never found him." Rick shook his head. "Damn, that's rough. You be careful out there, Neil. A lot of crazies on the road." "I will," I promised, though I knew it was easier said than done. Months turned into years, and the incident became a story I'd tell over coffee at truck stops, a cautionary tale for new drivers. But deep down, I always wondered what happened to that man, where he went, and if he ever tried to pull the same stunt on someone else. One night, about 5 years later, I got my answer. I was parked at a rest area in Tennessee, half asleep in my cab, when I heard a knock on my window. I jolted awake, heart racing. I peered out and saw a familiar face. "Rick, what the hell? You scared the crap out of me," I said, opening the door. "Sorry, Neil, but you gotta hear this," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Remember that guy who tried to knife you?" "Yeah. How could I forget?" "They caught him, down in Texas. Same Mo, broken down car, tried to stab a driver. Only this time, the driver had a gun." My breath caught. "Is he dead?" Rick nodded. "Driver shot him in self-defense. Cops Idaho'd him as a drifter with a long rap sheet. Figured you'd want to know. I sat back, processing the news. Relief washed over me, but so did a strange sense of closure. The man who'd haunted my nightmares was finally gone. Thanks, Rick. I appreciate it. Stay safe, Neil, he said, heading back to his truck. As I watched him go, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The road ahead felt a little less dangerous, a little more familiar. And though I knew there would always be risks, I also knew I could handle them. Because out there on the open road, you never know what's coming, but you keep going, 1 mile at a time. Imagine stopping at a rest area and discovering something horrifying in the trunk of a stranger's car. This trucker's decision to act led to a harrowing encounter that changed everything. My name is Clyde Jessup, and this happened to me on June 15, 1993. I was a truck driver back then, hauling goods across the country. That summer, I had a route that took me through the quiet back roads of West Virginia. It's a place where the mountains roll like an endless wave, and the trees seem to swallow the road whole. I was a simple guy, living out of my cab most days, enjoying the solitude and the open road. That particular run had me carrying a load of industrial supplies from Pittsburgh down to Charleston. It wasn't anything special, just another job. I remember the day clearly because it was hotter than hell and my truck's ACC was on the fritz. I was somewhere near Elkins, a small town nestled in the Monongahela National Forest. I'd been driving for hours, the sweat sticking my shirt to my back, when I decided to pull over at a rest stop to stretch my legs and grab a soda. The place was deserted, save for an old, beat-up sedan parked at the far end. It was the kind of spot you'd expect to see a family picnicking, but there wasn't a soul around. I climbed out of the cab, my boots crunching on the gravel, and headed toward the vending machine. As I reached into my pocket for some change, I heard a noise coming from the direction of the sedan. It was a faint thumping, like someone banging on a door. I glanced over, squinting against the sun, but I couldn't see anyone. My curiosity got the better of me, so I walked toward the car. When I got closer, I saw the car was in rough shape. The paint was peeling, and the windows were grimy with dust. But what caught my eye was the trunk. It was slightly ajar, and the thumping was louder now. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should mind my own business. But then I thought about what might happen if someone was in trouble and I did nothing. I approached the trunk cautiously and gave it a gentle push. It creaked open, revealing a sight that made my stomach churn. Inside was a woman, bound and gagged, her eyes wide with terror. She thrashed against her restraints, trying to scream through the cloth in her mouth. "Holy hell," I exclaimed, fumbling with the ropes that tied her wrists and ankles. "Hang on, I'll get you out of here." She was in bad shape, bruises covering her arms and face, but she managed to nod weakly. It took me a minute to get her free, and once I did, she practically collapsed into my arms. I helped her over to my truck and got her settled in the passenger seat, grabbing a bottle of water from the cooler behind my seat. "Who did this to you?" I asked, handing her the water. She drank greedily, coughing between gulps. I don't know," she stammered. "He grabbed me while I was walking to my car. Knocked me out. Next thing I knew, I was in that trunk." I looked around, my senses on high alert. "We need to get you to a hospital. Or the police." "No," she said, her voice urgent. "He's still out there. He'll come after us." I didn't need any more convincing. I fired up the engine and pulled out of the rest stop, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. We drove in silence for a while, the tension thick in the cab. I kept the speed steady, not wanting to attract any attention, but my heart was racing. "What's your name?" I asked after a while. "Laura," she replied, her voice trembling. "Laura Weston." "All right, Laura. I'm Clyde. We're going to get you some help, okay? Just hang in there." She nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. I didn't blame her. Whoever had done this was still out there, and we were racing against time. I decided to head for the nearest town, hoping to find a police station or a hospital. We reached Elkins in about 20 minutes, and I pulled into a gas station to ask for directions. The clerk, a young guy with a mullet and a name tag that read Randy, gave me a curious look when I asked about the police station. "Just a couple blocks down," he said, pointing to the south. "Take a left at the light, and you'll see it." "Thanks," I said, tossing a few bucks on the counter for a pack of smokes. "Appreciate it." I got back in the truck and followed Randy's directions. We found the station easily enough, a small brick building with a single squad car parked out front. I parked the truck and helped Laura out, her legs still shaky from the ordeal. Inside, the place was quiet. A bored-looking officer sat behind the desk, flipping through a magazine. He looked up as we entered, his eyes narrowing as he took in Laura's condition. "Can I help you folks?" he asked, setting the magazine aside. "This woman needs help," I said. "She was kidnapped and stuffed in the trunk of a car back at a rest stop." The officer's demeanor changed instantly. He stood up, grabbing a radio from the desk. "Ma, please have a seat. We'll get you some medical attention and take your statement." He called for backup and an ambulance, and within minutes, the station was buzzing with activity. Paramedics arrived and began tending to Laura while the officer took my statement. I recounted everything that had happened, from finding Laura to bringing her here. "Did you see anyone else at the rest stop?" he asked. "No, just the car," I replied. "Whoever did this is still out there." The officer nodded, scribbling in his notepad. "We'll send a unit out to investigate. Thank you for your help, Mr. Jessup." Laura was taken to the local hospital, and I was left standing outside the station, feeling a mix of relief and unease. I lit a cigarette and leaned against the truck, watching the sun dip below the horizon. It had been one hell of a day, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over yet. A couple of days passed, and I couldn't stop thinking about Laura. I called the hospital to check on her, but they wouldn't give me any information. "Privacy laws," they said. It made sense, but it was frustrating. I wanted to know she was okay. I decided to stay in Elkins for a bit, parked my truck at a nearby motel, and waited for news. One evening, as I was sitting in a diner nursing a cup of coffee, a man walked in and sat down at the counter. He was tall, with a wiry frame and a face that looked like it had seen too many bar fights. There was something about him that set off alarm bells in my head. I watched him out of the corner of my eye as he ordered a burger and a beer. He didn't seem to notice me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was dangerous. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe it was intuition. Either way, I decided to keep an eye on him. He finished his meal and left the diner, heading toward the parking lot. I tossed a few bills on the table and followed him outside, keeping a safe distance. He walked to a car that looked familiar, the same beat-up sedan I'd seen at the rest stop. My heart pounded in my chest as I ducked behind a nearby truck, watching him from the shadows. He opened the trunk and rummaged around, pulling out a roll of duct tape and a length of rope. It was him. It had to be. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking. I gave the operator my location and a description of the man, urging them to hurry. I watched as he closed the trunk and got into the car, my mind racing. I couldn't let him get away. I had a wrench in my truck, something I used for maintenance on the road. Without thinking, I grabbed it and approached the sedan. The guy was just starting the engine when I yanked open the driver's door and swung the wrench at his head. It connected with a sickening thud, and he slumped over the wheel. Panting, I stepped back, the wrench slipping from my grasp. I hadn't killed him. At least I didn't think so, but he was out cold. The sound of sirens filled the air, and within minutes, the police arrived, guns drawn. They cuffed the guy and took him away, and I gave my statement for the second time in as many days. It turned out he was a drifter with a record of assaults and kidnappings across several states. Laura was lucky to be alive, and the police assured me she would be well protected from now on. As for me, I finished my run to Charleston and went back to my usual routes. Life on the road had always been unpredictable, but that summer, it took on a whole new meaning. I never saw Laura again, but I hoped she found some peace after what she'd been through. I still think about her sometimes, especially on those long, lonely drives through the mountains. It's funny how one moment can change everything. That day in West Virginia reminded me that you never know what's around the next bend. Sometimes it's a beautiful view. Other times it's something much darker. But you keep driving, because that's all you can do. A cold December night, an abandoned truck, and a stranger's chilling warning what Mike Laramie found on the empty roads of Wyoming will haunt you long after you hear it. My name is Mike Laramie, and this happened to me on a cold December night in 2002. I was driving my rig through Wyoming, hauling a load of frozen goods to Denver. The interstate was empty, with only the sound of my engine and the occasional howl of the wind to keep me company. It was the kind of night where the world felt endless and lonely, the stars above stretching forever into the dark. I've always loved driving at night. There's a peace to it, a stillness that lets you clear your head. But that night was different. That night the road felt heavy, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I was about 3 hours out of Cheyenne when I saw it. Up ahead, in the distance, a pair of hazard lights blinked faintly through the darkness. As I got closer, I saw an old pickup truck pulled over on the shoulder. It was beat up and rusted, the kind of vehicle that looked like it had seen one too many winters. I slowed down, my headlights cutting through the night, and pulled up behind the truck. I've always believed in helping people out on the road. You never know when it might be you needing a hand. I grabbed my flashlight, threw on my jacket, and stepped out into the biting cold. As I approached the truck, I noticed the driver's door was open, but there was no one inside. The engine was off, and the air was eerily quiet, except for the sound of the wind whipping through the nearby trees. I shined my flashlight around, calling out, "Hello? Anyone here?" No response. I walked around the truck, looking for any sign of the driver. That's when I saw the footprints. They led away from the truck and into the snow-covered field beside the road. The tracks were fresh, and they disappeared into the darkness beyond my flashlight's beam. A part of me wanted to get back in my rig and keep driving. Something about the scene felt off, like a warning I couldn't quite put my finger on. But curiosity got the better of me. I followed the tracks, my boots crunching in the snow, my breath forming clouds in the icy air. The footprints led me to a small, dilapidated barn about 50 yards from the road. The structure was old, its wooden planks warped and weathered by years of harsh winters. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the flashlight switch. Every instinct told me to turn around and leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might need help. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was musty, filled with the scent of damp wood and decay. My flashlight illuminated the interior, revealing stacks of old hay bales and rusted farming equipment. At first it seemed empty, but then I heard a faint shuffling sound coming from the far corner of the barn. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing off the walls. "I'm here to help." The shuffling stopped. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a man, hunched over and shivering, his clothes tattered and covered in dirt. His eyes were wide and glassy, like he'd seen something that had shaken him to his core. "Are you okay?" I asked, taking a cautious step forward. The man didn't respond. He just stared at me, his lips moving silently as if trying to form words. I noticed his hands were trembling, and he clutched something tightly to his chest. It looked like a small, wrapped bundle, but I couldn't tell what it was. "Sir, do you need help?" I asked again, keeping my voice calm. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." A chill ran down my spine, and not from the cold. "Why not?" I asked, glancing around the barn. "What's going on?" Before he could answer, there was a loud bang from somewhere outside. It sounded like a gunshot, and it was close. The man flinched, his grip tightening on the bundle. "They're coming," he muttered, his voice trembling. "You need to leave. Now." My heart was racing. "Who's coming?" I asked, but he didn't answer. Instead, he shoved the bundle into my arms, his eyes desperate. "Take it," he said. "Get out of here. Don't look back." I looked down at the bundle, confused and alarmed. "What is this?" He didn't reply. Another bang echoed through the night, this time closer. The man pushed me toward the door, his voice urgent. "Go. There's no time." I stumbled out of the barn, clutching the bundle, and ran back toward my rig. My mind was racing with questions, but there was no time to think. As I reached my truck, I heard shouting behind me. I turned to see a group of men emerging from the shadows, their figures illuminated by flashlights. They were armed, and they were heading straight for the barn. I jumped into my cab, started the engine, and floored it. The tires spun in the snow before catching traction, and I sped down the highway, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the man's words from my mind. It wasn't until I was miles away that I dared to look at the bundle. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking as I unwrapped it. Inside was a small, intricately carved wooden box. It looked old, almost ancient, with strange symbols etched into its surface. I had no idea what it was or why the man had given it to me, but something about it felt significant. I debated calling the police, but something told me they wouldn't believe me. Instead, I decided to keep driving, putting as much distance between myself and that barn as possible. Whatever was in that box, it wasn't worth my life. To this day, I still don't know what happened that night. I never saw the man again, and I never found out who those men were or what they wanted. As for the box, it's hidden away in a storage locker, locked up tight. I've thought about getting rid of it, but something stops me every time. Some nights when I'm driving through the dark, I think about that man and his warning. You shouldn't have come here. Maybe he was right. Maybe some mysteries are better left unsolved. but one thing's for sure, I'll never forget that cold December night on the empty roads of Wyoming.